Clearly outlined, Baroque in style, the distant flotilla soared high above the water and land. Snow-white clouds floated slowly across the vast Ukrainian sky. They created a play of light, occasionally casting shadows on the surrounding landscape of forests and hills. At the edge of a small forest stood a peasant's cart, and in it was a huge barrel filled not with wine, but with something much more valuable: water. To the east, the ridge of hills became more gentle, resembling a painted landscape. On the third ridge, the greenery was still not withered under the scorching sun and was clearly visible. The fourth ridge was hidden behind a blue veil. Between them the Dniester carried its waters. Here and there lorries were moving, climbing up the hill and then disappearing again into the hollow. Smokes were rising between the trees. From somewhere above, the sound of a flying aeroplane could be heard. In reality, this peaceful landscape is a battlefield. German troops are trying to force the Dniester. The wind is blowing from the west, so from the edge of the forest does not come the rumble of artillery cannonade, although the river is only 4 kilometers away. In the forest, the medical unit has set up several tents, camouflaged with spruce and acacia branches. The acacia has already begun to dry. One of the tents is an operating theatre and, in a sense, is also a battlefield. At the mention of an operating theatre, one involuntarily recalls the snow-white floor, tiled walls, a large window covered with frost, the gleaming steel of an operating table with a large lamp burning above it, nickel sterilizers, surgical instruments. All these attributes are necessary to avoid infection, to get rid of pathogenic germs altogether. No unsterilized or disinfected instruments should touch a wound. In a field hospital, which is usually located some distance from the front line, it is quite easy to create all the necessary conditions, but this is not so easy to achieve in field surgical hospitals, which open medical companies right on the front line. The fate of a wounded man depends mainly on the surgeon into whose hands he has fallen. With every hour that passes from the moment of wounding until he is given first surgical aid, his chances of being saved diminish. An abdominal wound after 2 hours may be operated on with a good chance of success, but after 12 hours there is little chance of saving the wound. It is therefore of the utmost importance to locate a field surgical hospital as close to the front line as possible, even if it happens to be within range of enemy artillery. On the other hand, however, there is no point in showing unnecessary heroism and placing it so close to enemy positions that it can easily be destroyed. At the very beginning of the war, the division headquarters issued an order regulating the rules for the location of field surgical hospitals. Later, we began to choose our own location. When we had to perform operations during the retreat, we had to determine for ourselves how long we could perform operations in a given place without the risk of being captured. In selecting a site for a surgical field hospital, 3 factors are decisive. The first had to take into account the progress of the battle, the second was enemy fire, and the third was transport. It was needed both to transport the wounded to the field surgical hospital and to evacuate them to a hospital after they had received first surgical treatment. The organization of such a field surgical center requires little effort and depends entirely on personnel. The only necessary prerequisite for it is the availability of water. There were usually 2 medical companies in each German division, one of them motorized and the other equipped with horse-drawn transport. The personnel of the latter often used bicycles, although they often had to travel on foot. I was assigned to just such a company. The covered wagons of our medical company looked like props left over from the War of 1870. These horses, dragging along country roads and carrying medical equipment, were as far behind scientific progress as if they were competing in speed with Messerschmitts. The floor of the operating tent was nothing but black, slightly damp Ukrainian soil. The sloping sailcloth walls were thickly swarmed with flies. There was no window with frost-covered glass, but only a triangular opening that served both as an entrance and an exit. This opening had to be covered with a blanket to protect it from flies. Sterilization of instruments was carried out on an alcohol burner. The lighting lamp was powered by a battery. The instruments and other equipment were complete and up to date. Nothing was lost in the covered van that served as a dispensary. In charge of this van was Sergeant Kinzel. Although his surname had Swabian roots, Kinzel had been a brewer in Berlin before the war. He was a first-class organizer and had an innate gift for planning ahead. Never once, whether during the offensive or retreat, whether we were on the bridgehead or in the cauldron, whether during the fly-infested, sweltering Russian summer or during the icy Russian winter, was there a time when Kinzel did not have the right medicine at hand. From him no one ever saw any display of insane bravery, but he was a responsible, reliable man. Hundreds of wounded men must be grateful to him for their rescue. We had to operate in this place for 3 days, for it was 3 days that it took to break through Stalin's line. How miserable this tent in a small forest on the bank of the Dniester seemed then, but later I often remembered about it. The triangular entrance to the operating theatre with walls of sailcloth, through which the orderlies could barely squeeze the stretcher, was in a sense a magic door. A soldier, just a man, had been wounded. He had been wounded during the attack, and in an instant had become completely helpless. Until that moment, all his energy had been directed towards moving forward, towards fighting the enemy. He had been so immersed in everything that was happening that he had no time to think about himself. But now he was left to himself. The sight of his own blood made him immerse himself in his own problems. Just a moment ago, he could have changed the course of history, and in another moment he won't be able to help even himself. A few hours later, night falls upon the land. Terror overwhelms him. Is he destined to die of blood loss? Will they find him? Will he not be wounded again? Will the Germans not retreat? Will he not be captured by the Russians? An eternity passes until a few soldiers drag him back the shortest way possible. Here, in a crater from an artillery shell explosion, or in a hastily dug trench. There is a first aid station. There is a regimental doctor. The wounded soldier is bandaged, splinted and injected to relieve his suffering. He is then laid down on an empty seat, left to wonder whether he will be able to get out of here. Finally, he is about to be sent onwards and loaded into an ambulance. He ends up among many other injured people, lying in semi-darkness. The tense silence is broken only by the moans of those around him. After a long period of time, the paramedic reappears. From the moment the patient gets into the bright circle of light of the operating lamp, he ceases to be just a miserable, dirty, blood-stained, helpless body here on the operating table, again becomes a person who is cared for and provided with all the necessary assistance. This small miracle is helped by a sharp piece of steel, which weighs less than 100 grams and is called a scalpel. It concentrates the surgeon's skill accumulated over many years of study and work. This instrument is the embodiment of centuries of experience and a kind of symbol of the modern organization of medical service in the army. And over all this, over this small tent in the forest, on the bank of the Dniester, under the bottomless Ukrainian sky, flies a small proud flag, an invisible flag, the flag of humanism. At that moment we did not yet know whether under this flag we would come to victory or defeat. Stalin's line, which was a line of fortifications on the eastern bank of the Dniester, was broken through. The German troops crossed the river, and following them the engineer units ferried several ambulances to the opposite bank. These ambulances brought the wounded from the front line on the east bank of the river. Some of them were carried across the river on pontoons. More ambulances carried the wounded across the parched river bed to the steep west bank. A large Caterpillar tractor dragged them. Then, in other ambulance vans, they were brought to us. By then, we had moved closer to the river bank to shorten their journey. I had to go to division headquarters to find out what the situation was. A thunderstorm had just passed, accompanied by a heavy downpour. Almost all the vehicles were quickly getting stuck in the mud. This was the first warning as to what we could expect from the Russian soil. However, it was still summer. Within a few hours, the sun had dried all the mud from the thunderstorm. But in all its manifestations, and they were many, and often unpredictable, the mud proved as deadly an enemy to the wounded as the cold. But as yet we had not fully realized this. For the journey I chose a horse. On the way, as I rounded the edge of the forest, I saw a Protestant chaplain sitting on the ground. He had tied his horse to a tree and seemed to be looking for something. I dismounted. We had previously been acquainted and had a feeling of sympathy for each other. We had first met in a small church in France in 1940. During the offensive at Chemin de Dame, a surgical field hospital was located there. The church was destroyed during the First World War, but then painstakingly rebuilt, partly using the old masonry. The old stones stood out clearly against the newly rebuilt walls. We had a lengthy discussion concerning the round tile-covered towers that rose at the core. It was not without a sense of smugness that the scholar gave a whole lecture to the theologian. He explained to him that towers of this type, so-called round towers, could be found all the way from the Pyrenees to southern England. It was always extremely gratifying to meet someone of old acquaintance in a war zone. The first thing you feel is a sense of inner satisfaction and relief that this person is still alive. Then everyone starts telling stories about what has happened to them recently. It is often impossible to determine where the author's fantasy intertwines with real facts. But in meetings like this one, there is a chance to learn some valuable information. Two people greet each other when they meet in combat, just as the Athenians probably greeted each other when they met in the agora. What's new? The two of us sat down together on the trunk of the tree with the same feeling, as if we had sat down at a table in a cafe on the boulevard. The surgeon had good reason to appreciate the chaplain himself and his work. When the surgeon, the servant of men, reaches the limits of his ability, the servant of the Lord takes over. He can point the way. From the moment when the scientist helplessly spreads his arms to the gateway leading to eternity. A journey that requires comfort and confirmation from sources of knowledge deeper than science has ever possessed. The wounded man who dies in a surgical field hospital is not an invalid in the literal sense of the word. He is a man in the full bloom of life, cut untimely out of life before he has had time to do much. The despair of the young man, to whom fate has granted a few more hours of earthly life, is simply immense. And all the honors that the world pays to the fallen in battle cannot reduce his suffering in the slightest degree. Then the chaplain bows down before the dying man, while around him other wounded men are taking their meals. He has nothing in his hands but the book which gives real consolation. Very often I have admired these ministers of the Lord. To many they have brought comfort in their last hour. Even now I do not know exactly how to relate the story the chaplain told me at the time. On the previous afternoon, the attendant in charge of the food store had been brought to us. A stray shell, a few kilometers from the front line, had blown off his left arm and shattered his left knee. He was a completely harmless man. He was primarily concerned with beans and ham and had no thoughts of becoming a hero. We did all we could to stump his arm and amputate his leg. He didn't even lose very much blood. Sometimes when a limb is torn off, the walls of a blood artery narrow and are occluded by a blood clot which dissolves after a while. But the patient, this peaceful man, who had so suddenly fallen into the arms of death, had experienced a violent nervous shock. The state of nervous shock accompanying a wound is well known to physicians, and it is easy to define. It is an organic disorder of the nervous system, which leads to problems in blood circulation, interruptions of the pulse, muscle contractions, and to the failure of some other functions of the body. All these disorders are related to the functioning of the brain. Despite our best efforts, we were unable to bring the patient out of this condition. When I set out, he was dying. He asked the priest to send the watch he had to his wife as a gift from her. He wore it on his now lost left arm. He described the exact spot where he had been wounded. It was the very edge of the woods where we were sitting. It was the last wish of the unfortunate man who met death in the care of the storehouse entrusted to his care. Both priest and surgeon set about searching for the shell crater. This proved quite easy, for fallen trees lay all around. A crow was perched on the severed arm. The clock was still running. When I reached the division headquarters, I found the chief of staff sitting on a small folding chair. He was just having breakfast of ham and beans, taking them out of a tin can. The major of the general staff was a person of importance enough, but this great man had a friendly disposition, and there was a good reason for that. From the command's point of view, having first-class medical care for the wounded helped keep morale high among the troops. In addition, this shrewd man realized that no one would give him more reliable information about the real morale of soldiers than a field surgeon. The lightly wounded were always quite talkative, still full of the impressions of the horrors they had just experienced. From the scraps of information which usually reflected the situation on a tiny section of the front, and from the manner in which people talked about it, an experienced listener could always get a clear idea of the prevailing mood. The Major asked me just about this, and I also shared with him some of my personal impressions. The success of the offensive had encouraged the men and inspired them to new and even greater feats. Then I asked the Major about the small village of Golokani, located on the right bank of the river, where we were going to transfer our field surgical hospital. He smiled approvingly. The village was just near the crossing built by the division units. He had already given orders for a bridge to be built there. Then he looked at me and somewhat ironically said, "But Timoshenko is firing his heavy guns at it." On such occasions, decency demanded that one of the interlocutors should shrug his shoulders and say, "So why can't we destroy them?" The guns are about 20 kilometers from our positions and are so well camouflaged that aerial reconnaissance cannot detect them. We've sent for a unit equipped with sound-catching devices. Tell me, who is he, this Timoshenko? That's when I first heard about Marshal Timoshenko, who was said to command the entire southern flank of the Russian defense, bumping into the Black Sea. The Major had met the Marshal when, as an officer of the Rikmashwiya, he had been sent to Moscow. Timoshenko was a man of brilliant mind, and the Major considered him the best of those commanders that the Russians had. The simple sanity of the little man was nullified by the realization of the greatness of the events which he was able to witness every day, and which baffled him. I expressed my surprise that we had penetrated so deeply into Russian territory without, in fact, encountering serious resistance. The Major laughed. "Say clearly you don't keep a geographical atlas among your medical instruments. Resistance? Why should the Russians stand to the last man on the banks of the Dniester when they can organize a much more effective defense on the banks of the Volga?" He took a map of Russia out of his pocket. On this map, the distance we had been able to cover in the last 3 weeks was so insignificant compared to the rest of the country that it was barely visible. In fact, we never managed to carry out the encirclement of any significant forces of Timoshenko. During the summer campaign of 1941, he withdrew his forces to the Don. In the winter, we fully realized that they had retained their combat capability. In Golokani, there was an old-school building, built in Tsarist times. We were attracted by its strong stone walls. The military builders who had previously occupied the village willingly vacated it for us. There were strict orders that field surgeons should be given priority in the choice of quarters, but this time it was simply out of friendly motives. The commander of this construction unit was our old acquaintance, Captain Stubb. He had served as an engineer back in the First World War, and was from the town of Pirna on the Elbe. He was a true servant. He felt he was a necessary and happy man in wartime, as he could fully utilize some of the skills that nature had instilled in him, and which were completely useless in his mill in Pirna. We first met Captain Stubb in Bulgaria. Our unit had received orders to encamp in one of the valleys among the Rhodope Mountains, near the southern boundary of that country. On horseback, we reached the top of the mountain, then went down to study the valley with binoculars, and suddenly saw a scene as if borrowed from a book. In the shade of a huge rock shelter overlooking the riverbank, a fat man in suspender trousers was sitting at a newly chipped table under an acacia tree, drinking something that looked like coffee. We all agreed that he was a lover of the beautiful life, and rode up to him on horse. It was Captain Stubb. He looked at us with his shrewd little eyes, in which there was a certain distrust. Nevertheless, he offered us freshly brewed coffee, dismissing all our references to lack of time by saying that he would boil water on an acetylene burner within 30 seconds. We were only able to make the return journey in the evening, when he promised to pay us a return visit, and we had a big drink of vodka of his own making. Stubby was not a friendly person, but in fact he was always ready to help. He was as cunning as a fox when searching for food supplies, had a special pride in the bridges he built, but was indifferent to honours and awards. His main treasure were 12 15-ton tractors. These huge machines dragged pontoons for the construction of bridges across the vastness of Russia, and they were not afraid of neither mud nor snow. We always turned to Captain Stubb when we had difficulties with transport, and he never left us in trouble. Once he even sent his huge vehicles 100 kilometers away to help evacuate the wounded. On the banks of the Dniester we met again. The last time I saw him was in a famous Chinese restaurant opposite the Royal Palace in Bucharest. He was serving champagne to a gypsy band. Captain Stubb, like most Saxons, was very musical. One of the pontoons had been launched, and a huge winch was dragging it to the shore. Just as the major at headquarters had predicted, the Russians began shelling the village. 2 bursts, pause, 2 bursts, pause, shockwave from the bursting shells was very ear-splitting. We determined their calibre by finding one of the unexploded shells in the cemetery. The village was located on a hillside, so only a few houses at the top of the hill were under fire. We were out of the shelling zone, but we had no right to leave the wounded in an area that was still under enemy fire. So the tractor that carried the wounded to the top of the coastal steep and knocked clods of soft Ukrainian earth on its way from the riverbed located in the low-lying was provided to us by Captain Stubb. Poor things, he wailed. Even the consumption of 125 litres of petrol per hour, which he had allotted from his last reserve, did not seem to him too great a loss if it benefited these poor things. While I was making the operation, the Russians were firing a harassing bombardment from their long-range guns. For the first time, I tried to pretend that I simply did not notice it. The whole surgical team, which had never had to be on the front line before, followed my example. The behavior of a small team depends largely on the behavior of the leader, but when an artillery shell bursts from which, as in an earthquake, the ground shakes, even if it happens a few hundred meters away from you, panic may set in. It is an instinctive reaction. Rarely can anyone control it. In such a situation, a surgeon can use a scalpel to injure a patient. Within about 20 seconds, we heard the sound of a projectile flying towards us, and I put the scalpel aside before the explosion was even heard. A moment later, we heard a huge piece of shrapnel flying very close by. The windows in the school were large and low, almost reaching the ground. Then comes the thought that we should stop the operation, someone suggesting that we take shelter behind strong stone walls. But as I stayed where I was, everyone else also naturally followed my example. From the outside, one could observe a rather amusing picture. Sergeant Herman, my chief assistant, and I were sitting under the walls with our hands up, so as not to get our sterilized rubber gloves dirty. For some time, the unfortunate wounded man had no defense against shell splinters. Corporal Kubanki. Before the war, he had worked as a night waiter in a Berlin bar, was endowed with an innate Berlin wit and the ability to assess a situation with a single phrase. "Mere rose in white," he muttered, looking innocently at the basement. Spurred on by fear, the polite surgeon cut deeper than he was supposed to. We laughed. Corporal Kubanki looked exactly the same after sterilizing his instruments as he had when he was arranging the bottles in front of the bar patrons, standing in a well-protected corner. After the several explosions that followed, Herman and I still remained near the operating table. By mid-afternoon, the field surgical hospital was empty. For a while, the wounded stopped coming in. The construction of the bridge over the river was completed. Eventually, even the artillery fire subsided. I sent for our messenger. Everyone called him Sambo, and like many others from our unit, he was from Berlin. If you happen to go to war, it's best to fight in the company of Berliners. They're indomitable, and not only when things are going well. The worse the situation is, the more clearly their high morale and sharpness of mind can be seen. Sambo was from the Mannstrasses, Koppenplatz neighborhood, one of the most disadvantaged areas of the city. He was a sturdy, cunning, and cheerful young man with a broad Slavic face. His mouth seemed to be specially designed for a wide grin, with which the corporal could express a whole range of different moods. He was an excellent driver. There was always some booty in the cradle of his motorbike, and he was always ready to swap it for something. Even the motorbike itself was a trophy of war. It was a heavy Harley-Davidson, which Sambo found in France. Sambo was a guy who knew where to look for what he wanted. The resourcefulness of a messenger is a matter of vital importance to the unit in which he serves. All brilliant orders will be of no avail if they do not reach those to whom they are intended. It must be remembered that during maneuver warfare, the divisional headquarters, where most decisions are made, frequently change their location. During the following year, Sambo of Koppenplatz developed a remarkable ability to navigate unerringly over the vast expanse between Bessarabia and the Caucasus. We could rarely supply him with a map, but Sambo prided himself on the fact that he could get to any place, and he did. This time he had a simple task. I had sent him to Captain Stubb to invite him to breakfast. Now we were sitting in the sunshine. "I'm not familiar," said Stubb, "with these damned long-range guns, but I don't like them at all." "Neither do I, but there's nothing to be done about it." "Right after breakfast," said Stubb, "they're going to fire specifically at us." "How do you know?" "My dear doctor, think calmly. Our Russian friends are eating their borscht now. When they finish it, they'll open fire on the other half." "What's the other half?" "The other half of the shelling sector. In artillery fire, the target is divided into two semicircles. For 2 hours they've been shelling one sector, now for 2 hours they'll be shelling the other sector." This was an apt occasion for Stubb to expound his theory. Sergeant Herman, who had been listening to our conversation, suddenly cut in. "Sambo found a lonely farm south of the village, less than a kilometre from here. It's perfect for a surgical field hospital, plus there's an orchard full of ripe cherries." I was in a stupid position. Captain Stubb is probably right. Artillery fire will make our work much more difficult. Of course, I can always justify myself by saying that the relocation of the hospital was necessary for the safety of the wounded, but I had no orders, only an unpleasant trembling in my knees. That is, I had a feeling called fear. This feeling is familiar to everyone, and everyone knows that others can also experience it, but not everyone talks about it. Fear was a taboo subject. In the end, it was sheer madness to save my face at the cost of losing someone else's life, and only to gain just 1 day, as then I would have to change my location anyway. I gave the order to relocate the field surgical hospital to a farm south of the village. The first thing we did when we got there was to eat cherries, which we ate to our heart's content. Then more wounded began to arrive. We started doing operations again. An hour later, Sambo appeared in the operating theatre and shelled. The old school in the village has been destroyed by a direct hit from a shell. Sergeant Herman and I looked at each other with sour grins. When a shell hit the old school, which had been built in Tsarist times, 3 soldiers near it were seriously wounded. They were assigned to the Stubb pontoon park, so we made every effort to save as many men from death as possible. Young soldiers were favoured over those who had taken part in the First World War. Thanks to the insight of Captain Stubb, who predicted the behaviour of the artillerymen, I earned a reputation for having a sixth sense and being able to foresee approaching danger. Later, this always enabled me to exercise caution in selecting the location of the surgical field hospital. My subordinates, of course, were very pleased that I had such a sense, and I did have it, but it was often only a screen, and the motives for it could be quite different. But that. There is no doubt that it was of great benefit. As we were no longer under fire, we could keep for a short time those wounded whose immediate evacuation immediately after the operation presented well-known difficulties. We received 2 soldiers who had served in an artillery battery, both of whom had been wounded by the explosion of the same shell. One was a handsome young lieutenant who had had the lobe of his left ear blown off, and the other was a corporal who had had his thigh pierced by shrapnel. The corporal had lost a great deal of blood before the regimental doctor at the first aid station was able to apply a dressing to his thigh over the wound, and he was now in a state of collapse. Such shock, or vascular shock, is by no means the same as nervous shock. It is primarily due to a lowering of the pressure caused by a considerable loss of blood. In such cases, blood transfusion is the best remedy. It is done before the operation, as the patient without it may simply not tolerate it. With the help of a special device, blood from a vein in the donor's arm is transferred into a vein in the patient's arm. There is a risk of blood clotting, and air must not be allowed into the blood pumping device, because in just a few seconds an air bubble can cause a blockage in an important blood artery, leading to the sudden death of the patient. This is called an embolism. One is always deeply impressed by the sight of a pale, often yellowed and almost unconscious patient who slowly regains consciousness after this procedure over the next quarter of an hour. The heart begins to beat more vigorously as it receives a large quantity of blood, and it begins to pump it. Gradually, the patient's cheeks take on a normal color. Eventually, he fully regains consciousness and can even take part in conversation. In this case, the young lieutenant served as a donor for the corporal. Their blood types matched. As is usually the case in such cases, after the blood transfusion, the patient who had been wounded in the thigh quickly regained consciousness. Wounds of this type, in which not only bone but also soft tissue is damaged, are the most feared by military surgeons. It is one of the most dangerous wounds as it poses the risk of gangrene. In such a case, the wounded person's life can only be saved by amputation, but this is too high a price to pay. Of course, if the surgeon decides to save the leg and everything goes well, it cannot but be satisfying. However, if he decides not to amputate and then it turns out that he cannot save the leg, the patient's life is at risk. Such a decision is not an easy one to make, but the surgeon cannot shirk it. He must take a clear stand. The most reliable counselor in such cases is usually his own experience, but there is always some element of uncertainty, let us call it the X factor, which usually rests not on reason, but on subconscious instincts. There have been doubtful cases when it has been decided whether a patient should have an arm or a leg removed to save his life, while in other cases such doubts have not even arisen. At the very beginning of the war, we stood on very conservative positions in the sense that we tried at all costs to save the wounded their arms and legs. This cost the lives of many good men. Later, when conditions began to gradually deteriorate, we began to act more decisively. In this case, the decision was easy to make. Examination of the wound showed that the soft tissue damage was not very significant. There was no particular difficulty in treating the entire surface of the wound. We treated the wound and applied a large plaster, leaving a small hole in it through which we could watch the healing process without removing the dressing. In the evening, the attendant told us of the patient's reaction to the measures we had taken. He had come off the anesthetic medication and asked what had been done to him. Naturally, he was very happy that we had not amputated his leg. When he was informed that his lieutenant had provided the blood for transfusion, he calmly remarked, "Oh, now I've got officer blood in my veins. Now I must demand a promotion." After this tirade, he smoked a cigarette and then fell into the sound sleep of a convalescent man. I don't know if he's still alive. He may have returned to his unit when his leg healed and is now probably felling wood somewhere near the Arctic Circle, but it is possible that he has long since been buried somewhere in the vastness of Russia. In the course of time, my subordinates had learnt to adapt even the most miserable shacks scattered across the steppe as operating rooms. I actually felt genuine admiration and helplessness when I saw the skill with which they did it. The provision of light camouflage has always presented well-known difficulties, although Russian aviation only became a real threat towards the end of the war. A predatory, bloodthirsty bird circled over our heads almost every night and occasionally dropped a bomb somewhere in our immediate vicinity. The soldiers called this nocturnal visitor the planter. It never bothered us much, because the gas burner used for sterilization and the generator that provided electricity for the light bulbs in the operating theatre made so much noise that it drowned out the noise from the aircraft. The door from the improvised operating theatre usually led directly to the street. As a rule, we draped it with horse blankets. This kept the light out of the house when someone left the room or came through the door. But, of course, the opening had to be large enough for 2 orderlies with stretchers to pass through. We always worked under artificial light, and because of this it always seemed as if we were working at night. The atmosphere inside the operating theatre was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, alcohol. Every now and then I would go outside for a few breaths of fresh air, and each time I would be slightly confused when I saw the sun shining in the sky. When I had finished another operation, and my skillful assistants were busy putting a bandage on the wound, I usually sat down on a small crate, leaning my back against the wall for a little break. I smoked a cigarette, holding it, to avoid contamination, with sterilized surgical tweezers. An orderly stood next to me and helped me drink a cup of coffee. If I touched the cup, I would have to disinfect my hands every time after I allowed myself a short rest. After the dressing was completed, the wounded man was placed on a stretcher. This required some skill, as the patient could be in great pain. It was usually done by two experienced orderlies who had learnt to synchronize their movements. In our surgical team was Sergeant Meyer. Before the war, he had been a successful retailer somewhere in the western part of Berlin. He had no idea he had a medical aptitude. He had made bandaging a real art, and was particularly good at applying plasters of all kinds. He was a tall, sturdily built man who always maintained an unwavering calmness, and who happened to be a keen football fan. In addition, he was sincerely attached to us. Once, returning from leave, he got into a marching column and was ordered to stay in another unit. He simply deserted and came back to us. However, he was cunning enough to steal his papers in the confusion of that unit and bring them back with him. He was helped by the fact that his surname was Meyer, which is very common in Germany. It seemed that Sergeant Meyer could stand on his feet like a rock for hours and even days. I never saw him tired. He was so strong that he could move a wounded man from the operating table to a stretcher by himself. I still remember those fierce, fast and powerful movements, as well as his special, exceptional politeness. We called him the Working Angel. So once the patient was on the stretcher, Corporal Kubanki would stow his steel helmet, gas mask and supply bag beside him. This was part of his duties. If the patient was conscious, or at least semi-conscious, the orderlies often made various jokes. "Love your girlfriend. Send us a postcard from Berlin." As he was carried out, the surgeon would cast a parting glance at the patient, and in fact it was extremely rare that he had to see him again, although in all probability his life was out of danger this time. After a short interval, the next wounded man was brought in, and so it went on hour after hour, day after day, year after year. It was a grim conveyor belt, stretching from the thick of the battle to our operating theatre. We could not show any special favour to any. We simply could not afford it. Otherwise we would soon find ourselves in a state of complete nervous exhaustion, and would be unable to continue working. Sympathy is the natural feeling of a simple man who can give nothing more. For us, helping another wounded man was simply a new job, and our efforts were not always only physical. No doubt good physical fitness, just as professional skill, is essential to any surgeon, but the greatest responsibility is imposed upon him. For any wounded man has a right to expect that his problem will be solved in the best possible way for him. The 100th patient has exactly the same rights as the first. Each is a unique and distinctive individual, but there have been times when we have been unable to help. We knew nothing about how these people had lived before, and we had no time to ask them about it. There were always a few wounded people lying in the waiting room waiting for their turn on the operating table, and there was always the possibility that another ambulance van would arrive, filled with critically wounded people who would have to be treated urgently. Did this soldier have a wife who never wrote to him? Was he an artist or a writer who still hopes to paint his best pictures or write his best book? Was he a scoundrel that no one would particularly regret? Whatever the case, he was a human being, and he needed to be helped. And that was all we knew about him. I was still sitting on my little crate. The wounded man's first priority was to remove the remnants of clothing near the part of his body he had been shot in. If necessary, to reduce pain, this could be done with large tailor's scissors. If necessary, boots were also cut. Toward the end of the war, we received an order that boots were to be cut, only as a last resort. However, the order did not say anything about causing unnecessary pain to a wounded man. Eventually, the order came that boots were to be removed from the dead. A funeral in war is without unnecessary ceremony, but it was still a shame that a pair of boots was spared for a soldier killed in battle. Sergeant Meyer managed to undress the wounded with dexterity and care. When he did so, he made a few lewd jokes, which made the wounded man think that he was not as bad as he thought. And how bravely the wounded behaved. Even the suppressed groans were rare. Evidently, they were soothed by the strong, skillful hands of the men around them. Here, away from the terrifying loneliness of the battlefield, free from the fear of being captured, a man slowly began to raise the fluttering flag of hope. In the operating theatre, my assistant lay down to rest away from the newly sterilized instruments. The anesthesiologist prepares the anesthetic mask. The doctor is examining the wounded soldier, trying to figure out if he needs a blood transfusion. Then the surgeon gets up from his box. An assistant helps him put on rubber gloves sprinkled with powder inside. With a deft movement, he first slips his hand into the right glove, then into the left, and then pulls them tight. The wounded man watches his every move. What does he think of all this? These creatures in their rubber gloves most resemble butchers, and he still doesn't know which one of them is the surgeon, which one of them holds his life in his hands. Then the surgeon looks at him. No. How old are you? When were you wounded? Where were you wounded? You don't get a chance to talk for a long time. There is simply no time for that. But in any case, you can say a few encouraging words to the wounded man. It is very important to instill confidence in the patient. Bandages removed, wound examined. Sometimes the diagnosis is not difficult. Just look at the bullet entry and exit wounds to assess the extent of the damage. The trajectory of a bullet rarely passes through the body in a straight line. This happens only in cases where the fire was conducted at close range, and even then it is not always certain. Sometimes the most unbelievable things happen. I remember a man who was mortally wounded in the center of the forehead. The bullet went through and out the back of his head. By all rules, he should have died, but the incredible thing happened. The bullet went through the skull without hitting any vital centers. And there are many such unusual cases. When the entry and exit wounds from the bullet are found, you must assess which internal organs may have been affected. Some those difficult cases are those where the bullet is lodged in the body. From the nature of the entry wound, you try to determine where it might be. But how far into the body? For reasons unknown to me to this day, it was forbidden to use a metal detector when examining a wound. But nevertheless, I used it often. Any member of our brigade smiled at the moment when, with the help of metal detector, managed to find a piece of metal deeply stuck in the body. But such luck was rare, much rarer than I would have liked. The limbs were the best to heal. At first, the wounded man lay undressed. Even so, I couldn't always find the bullet, but at least we had a chance to dress the wounded man properly, so the people who were part of the operating team, who were always present in complete silence during the examination, over time became excellent diagnosticians themselves. Very often one look at the injured limb was enough to realize that amputation was not an option. What was really difficult was to make a decision in doubtful cases, for example, when dealing with severely injured limbs, to save or to amputate. The biggest challenge was injuries to the abdomen, chest, back and neck. In such cases, the use of a metal detector was especially necessary. All available diagnostic methods had to be used. There was a well-defined and well-developed procedure for this purpose. First of all, the surgeon recorded all external signs: the condition of the bullet entry and exit wounds, facial expression, sensitivity to pain, abdominal firmness, rapid breathing, and the like. This allowed him to make a tentative diagnosis. He then tried to find other symptoms that would allow him to determine whether the provisional diagnosis was correct. Based on the totality of the symptoms, he would make a final diagnosis. To do this, he must consider all possibilities, but he must also choose only one of them. This requires a high level of concentration and the ability to navigate freely through the accumulated knowledge of modern surgery. In some ways, his labor can be compared to a radar searching for a tiny plane in the stratosphere. The real skill of a surgeon in wartime is also manifested in the fact that you have to gather strength 20 times a night, even though you may be in a state of complete physical exhaustion. A surgeon has no right to shirk his duties. He must start performing them immediately. Otherwise, in a few minutes, his scalpel may no longer be useful. This can cost the life of a brave man who did not have the opportunity to choose who would operate on him. Successful and unfortunate diagnoses. In those dirty, dusty huts scattered across the vast Ukrainian steppe, I remembered with gratitude the surgical lessons of my old teacher. He taught us to be ruthless. He also taught us that a surgeon must have the courage to cut the Gordian knot when necessary. He must have the courage to admit his mistake. Medicines, painkillers, please. I have probably handled thousands of wounded men, but I remember only a few of them clearly. The wounded man seems to emerge from the terrifying darkness in this small, brightly lit shelter, but the surgeon addresses him with only a few words. He looks at the wounded man's face for only a few seconds. Then an anesthetic mask is placed over the patient's face and covered with sterile towels. He becomes a mere case with a definite set of symptoms to be studied carefully, thoughtfully, and evaluated scientifically. The primary purpose of all this is to save a human life. Preserving his physical data to the greatest possible extent is a secondary objective. Let us turn again, for example, to the question of whether a limb should or should not be amputated. There are clear cases when a limb is badly damaged, and there is no other choice. There are also clear cases of a different kind, when the injury is mild and the question of amputation simply does not arise, even if the joints are damaged. The joints are the most susceptible to infection, but there are doubtful cases where it is not clear whether amputation should be performed. That said, a surgeon who has the goal of saving as many of his patients' lives as possible may amputate many limbs that could have been saved. A careful surgeon will save patients' arms and legs that another would have amputated without a shadow of a doubt, but over the course of his career, he will lose many who might still be alive. We have all met someone in our lives who has stated, "The doctors wanted to amputate my leg, but I refused. Look, my leg is intact." That story always makes surgeons look bad. The other kind of story you won't hear, it's a man who could have told it is dead. He refused an amputation, and it cost him his life. Clearly, the patient's zest for life and good humor are important factors in surgery. At times, the surgeon can afford to take risks in reliance on the healthy optimism of the injured person, although it would certainly be wrong for the surgeon to try to absolve himself of responsibility in this way. The despair of losing a limb increases over time. The decision not to live with a mutilated body is fleeting, but death is eternal. To all these considerations should be added another feature of surgical operations in wartime, which is very different from the conduct of such in peacetime. The question of the situation at the front, the question of whether to operate or not, depends not only on medical indication. The tactical situation also plays an important role. Surgery during the offensive is very different from surgery during the retreat. Surgery in summer is not the same as surgery in winter. During an offensive, the active opposition of the enemy gradually diminishes. The enemy tries to withdraw his artillery to safety. His air cover is engaged over the firing line, or he tries to prevent the enemy from concentrating his forces. You can leave wounded at the assembly point, and they will be treated after a short transport as field hospitals also advise. During the retreat, however, the enemy's firepower is constantly increasing. The wounded have to be evacuated at once. The surgical field hospital must be prepared to move in the hour of approaching danger, often unable to resolve the tragic dilemma of whether or not to abandon the wounded. From an ethical point of view, the right thing to do in such a situation would be to stay with the wounded. But in practice, this means the loss of hundreds of lives. A division that loses one of its two field surgeons will soon face certain difficulties. The second of the remaining surgeons will not be able to make up for this loss, as it is already working at the limit of its capacity. In summer, it is not so difficult to save a wounded limb with impaired circulation, but in the cold the limb becomes inflamed, and gangrene soon occurs. When evacuation from a surgical field hospital to the rear is postponed several times, temperature becomes a vital factor which can have exceptionally grave consequences for the wounded. We have already had a rather comical prelude to a situation of this kind, which in the last years of the war became quite commonplace. While the army under Timoshenko was rapidly rolling back towards the new line of defense along the bank of the Dnieper, we again set up our hospital in tents, camped a few kilometers east of the Dnieper. For several days it rained heavily. Almost all the vehicles sank in the mud, and we reported every day to our superiors in the army corps that from 70 to 100 wounded were sent to the rear. The chief of the Corps Medical Service was on the other side of the Dniester. For several days he tried to get to us to arrange one of the regular checks, but every time his car got stuck in the mud, and when he returned to his headquarters on foot, he always found our message notifying him of the number of wounded we had sent to the rear. Eventually he did turn up at our field surgical hospital, and in very bad spirits. The hospital was empty except for one patient, whom we had carefully concealed. In keeping with strange army psychology, our company commander, who had made the evacuation of the wounded very successful, received no thanks. Instead, he received a rocket, or to be more precise, a whole salvo of them. The Chief of Medical Service of the Corps asked with what vehicles we evacuate the wounded. We realized that he did not trust the figures we were telling him. Naturally, this miracle was only possible thanks to the tractors that Captain Stubb provided us with, but we promised the captain that we would not tell anyone about it, and we kept our word. This was not for selfish reasons. There was no doubt that if we revealed our secret, the Corps Medical Chief would be constantly trying to borrow tractors from the commander of the pontooners. The immediate consequence of this would be that Captain Stubb would simply stop giving us tractors. Our ability to ignore absurd orders increased rapidly as the war in Russia continued. But at that time, Captain Stubb still had to rigorously follow all orders. We could have lost his kind assistance, and there would have been nothing to replace it. So we kept our mouths shut. The Chief of Corps Medical Services left us in a much worse frame of mind than the one in which he had arrived. To our great relief, we learnt a few days later that he had sent his adjutant on an inspection of the hospitals to check the number of wounded received there against the information we had given in our reports, and he was satisfied that it was accurate. Captain Stubb was quite pleased that the story ended in this way, and in his joy ordered a couple of pigs to be slaughtered, and then treated our whole company to boiled meat, and to top it off there was also beer. At one time he had bought a small keg in Bucharest. All this time it had been stored under one of his huge pontoons. After the meal, the conversation once again turned to our only patient. His story still remains in my memory with all its details. He came to us with numerous shrapnel wounds in both arms, which were quite dangerous, although he had not lost too much blood. Because of this, he was able to move about on his own. The sleeves of his overalls were cut open, and his hands hastily bandaged and encased in bows. As mine fragments are usually large and sharp-edged, they can cause considerable damage to soft tissue. The edges of such wounds always appear lacerated, and in such cases the threat of gas gangrene is particularly high. GS gangrene is caused by an anaerobic bacterium that multiplies only in the absence of air, releasing gas into the soft tissues, which quickly leads to their decomposition. Its presence is indicated by a whistling sound, which appears when the doctor feels the area of the lesion with his hand. It is released gas bubbles. The only reliable method of treatment in such cases is the removal of the damaged tissue. The damaged area is opened up and all the damaged pieces of tissue are gently removed. Air should be allowed to penetrate all parts of the wound. It is then washed with hydrogen peroxide. This promotes oxygen penetration into the soft tissues and acts as a disinfectant. The operation must be carried out with great care. If even the smallest area of damaged tissue is overlooked, it will be a source of further infection. There was also an anti-gangrene serum, but it was not very effective. Good results were achieved only when it was injected directly into the affected area, but it was dissolved by the flow of blood. A few months before the events described, When I was in Greece in the newly occupied Fort Hellas, which was part of the defense of the Metaxa line along the Turkish-Bulgarian frontier, a Greek colleague asked me to provide him with a serum for gangrene. In order not to appear impolite, Sergeant Kienzel unpacked half of his supplies. He knew exactly in which box and on which shelf were kept the 5 ampoules of anti-gangrene serum that constituted our inviolable stockpile. A Greek surgeon was trying to help a patient whose tongue was gangrenous. The serum was injected directly into the base of the tongue and the patient recovered. Our patient in Russia was a young man of about 22 years of age. He was a student at a technical college somewhere in the southern part of Germany. Unfortunately, my approach to him was tactless from the start. "You were in the 6th Company of the Reinhardt Regiment, weren't you? Were you among the soldiers who were splitting those boxes at Hill 201? Were you there?" Yes, I was there. It was a real scorcher out there. This story of the unparalleled bravery of a small group of infantrymen became a legend in less than a day. The wounded man looked at me in silence. Then he looked at his bandages. I still didn't know what lurked beneath them. Suddenly a feeling of shame swept over me. It was easy for me to talk and think and feel within normal boundaries. Probably he had no more hands. He had them, but what a sight they were! After a thorough examination, which was very painful, but which he endured stoically, it was found that both his hands were so mutilated that they had to be amputated. But just imagine what it means for a young man to lose both hands, and as a student, and at the age of 22. The thought suddenly flashed through my mind that he would never be able to hug a girl. The student was carefully watching my actions. He gazed into the expressions of our faces with the kind of discernment of which man is capable only in moments of supreme tension. Sergeant Hermann immediately understood how to behave. We glanced at each other. Although our facial expressions were impenetrable, the student understood everything. We told him that we would do our best. The student nodded in agreement. Then we proceeded with the operation. First, I took care of the left arm. As soon as I assessed the extent of the damage, I realized that the situation was hopeless, and this despite the fact that the blood circulation in the arm was preserved. The part where the numerous nodes connecting the various arteries were located survived, but both of the main arteries were damaged. Most of one of them was lost altogether, so that I could not even make an arterial suture. But even if I had been able to do so, the prospects were still very bad. I had cut the left forearm about halfway down. The chances of saving the right arm looked a little more optimistic. At least only one of the 2 main arteries was injured. If only the right arm had been injured, its significant damage and the consequent threat of gas gangrene would have forced me to amputate it, especially since the arm would still be semi-paralyzed. In this case, however, the situation was not quite hopeless. I had to try to save it. The patient felt well after the operation. However, he remained silent in a state of melancholy. Sergeant Hermann looked after him. Hermann had a great innate kindness and courtesy, and he was old enough to be the student's father. His main profession was that of a hospital orderly, so he knew a little about surgery. He was sturdy on his feet, and if you compared him to an aeroplane, he was, so to speak, a Junkers 52, an old, slow anti-U transport aeroplane. Some of the slowness, however, was simply a reflection of the peace that reigned in his soul, as well as his exceptional reliability and self-confidence. Sergeant Hermann looked after the student as if he were his own son. Our whole brigade watched his recovery with interest. The stableman, rough but loyal man, brought eggs and chickens. Sambo organized a supply of honey and wine. The company commander asked the divisional chaplain to come. The Holy Father had a long conversation with a student. The student wanted to talk to him. Usually he sat silent, immersed in gloomy melancholy. But we did not evacuate him to the rear. He could have been left without medical attention for hours on this journey. Sergeant Meyer freed the student's fingertips from the bandages to facilitate blood circulation in them. The next day they were warm. The student was even able to move them a little. Everything seemed to be going well. On the 3rd day, Sergeant Hermann came running with disturbing news that a student had tried to commit suicide with a hand grenade. He had only failed to pull the pin due to his poor condition. On the fourth day, he suddenly developed a high fever. Gangrene began to develop despite all the precautions we took. We were compelled to amputate the infected part of his right arm, just above the elbow, all this being done to save the life of its owner, to whom it had now lost all meaning. Soon we received orders to move forward. We were forced to leave our patient behind. I never heard from him again. However, the members of our surgical team realized from this example that even 100 successful operations are devalued by one such failure. I don't know, did the student commit suicide, or did some girl pluck up the courage to marry him? And didn't he repent of it afterwards? The legend of Altitude 201 was created at the cost of a young man's desperation.